Carol Whitfield opened the compartment door at 3:31. She would later say she already knew something was wrong while still in the corridor, before she even looked inside. It was the silence. Not the silence of sleeping passengers, something else entirely. Car 6, 3 people. Each of them, the throat, one knife, and no one left alive. By that point, the onboard recorder had been logging the same thing for 17 minutes. Emergency signal received, braking not initiated, train in motion. The emergency brake in car 7 had been pulled at 3:14. The signal traveled to the locomotive's control system. It was received. It was logged. The system should have triggered emergency braking within 4 to 6 seconds at most. The train did not stop. It kept moving for another 12 minutes, 138 kilometers per hour. A dark stretch of track between Springfield and Litchfield. No lights beyond the windows, just black farmland and the stars above it. At 3:26, engineer Frank Pullman, 47 years old, received a signal from dispatch, from the central hub through a secondary channel. The train stopped 2 kilometers short of the Farmersville junction. Pullman climbed down onto the embankment, looked along the length of the train. The door to car 7 was open. The step was lowered. But you have to start somewhere else, with how everything looked normal, with 3 people riding toward where they were headed, with an evening that started like any other, and with one person who knew something no one else on that train knew. That on this train, on this route, on this night, he would have exactly 12 minutes. He had calculated it in advance, not guessed, calculated. But to understand how it worked, you have to start at the beginning, at the platform, at the backpack, at 2 friends who were still laughing. Train 142 from Chicago to St. Louis departed on schedule at 10:10 p.m. November. The platform at Chicago Union Station was wet from a light drizzle. Lights reflected in puddles in long yellow streaks. Porters rolled their carts. An announcement over the PA, calm voice, routine. Daniel Mercer and Kevin Holt had known each other 14 years. They met as freshmen at the College of Education, shared a dorm room for 3 years on West Harrison Street, then went their separate ways. Chicago, Rockford, back to Chicago. They were heading to Daniel's father's birthday celebration, 60 years old, a dinner at a restaurant in St. Louis, the whole family. Holt had brought a bottle of bourbon for the ride. Mercer had a thermos of coffee and a bag of homemade sandwiches. The compartment was booked for 2. Then a 3rd passenger joined. Marcus Webb boarded in Springfield. 26 years old, heading back to St. Louis after a work stint. He'd been doing construction work in Bloomington for 4 months, barely a day off. He was a man of few words. He took off his jacket, hung it on the hook, pulled out his phone, exchanged a couple of sentences with Mercer about the weather in St. Louis, climbed onto the lower bunk. They didn't know each other. They ended up together by chance. Same compartment, same route, same schedule. None of them had chosen this train for any reason that would have mattered. Just tickets, just a night. But each of the 3 had something of their own in this trip, a detail that would later survive in the case files and in the memories of people who knew them. Mercer was carrying a gift for his father, an old photograph found at the family's summer house. Father and son, summer of 1987, both laughing. He'd found it in August, spent a long time deciding what kind of frame to use. In the end, he'd wrapped it in newspaper and put it in his backpack. He wanted to pull it out right there in the restaurant, in front of everyone. Holt was making the trip for the first time in 2 years. He'd been talking about it with Mercer on the platform. That he hadn't been to St. Louis since the divorce. That he couldn't bring himself to go somewhere full of memories. Now he could. Sounds like you're finally over it, Mercer said. Holt nodded. Webb wasn't just going home from a job site. He was going to see his daughter, 4 years old. He hadn't seen her in 8 months. On his phone, in the photos folder, the last picture had been taken in March. A little girl with an ice cream cone squinting in the sun. The forensic team saw that photo when they unlocked his phone the following day. At 11:52 p.m., Raymond Doyle appeared in the corridor of Car 7. Conductor Carol Whitfield, 53 years old, 22 years on this route, had noticed him when he boarded in Chicago. She remembered him. "He walked right past me without saying a word," she would tell Detective Alan Shaw the next day. "I always greet my passengers, always, and they always respond. He just walked past, like I wasn't there. You know, it wasn't even rudeness. It was something else." Doyle's ticket was legitimate. His compartment was Car 6, the adjacent one. Whitfield didn't do anything. There were no grounds to. At 11:52, Doyle knocked on compartment 6 and opened the door without waiting for an answer. Why, he would later explain in different ways, he was looking for an outlet. He had the wrong door. He wanted to ask if there was coffee available in the car. The story changed from one interview to the next. Detective Shaw logged every version. Mercer asked him to leave. Doyle responded, quietly, but in a way that made Holt look up from his phone. Mercer repeated himself. Doyle picked up a cup from the little table, someone else's, set it back down, slowly, like he was sizing something up. Then Webb stood up, the construction worker from Bloomington, 6'2". He didn't say a word. He just stood up and looked. Doyle held his ground for a moment, then left. Mercer said, "Forget it, no big deal." Holt nodded. Webb lay back down. They talked for another 40 minutes or so, about the upcoming birthday dinner, about prices in St. Louis, about Holt's plan to move to the city next year. Then they turned the light off. Doyle, at this point, was sitting alone in the next compartment. He had no bunkmates. He'd bought a solo berth several days before departure, paid a premium for his own space. That detail, too, would later enter the case file. 30 minutes after the light went out in compartment 6, the corridor of Car 7 went quiet. According to cell tower data, all three stopped using their phones between 1:10 and 1:20 a.m. Whitfield walked through the car at 1:35. Compartment 6 was silent. Car 8 had no lights on. Door closed. She didn't check inside. Detective Shaw would later say, between 1:35 and 3:14, a gap of 99 minutes. Everything happened in that gap. But there was a detail in that gap that Shaw didn't notice right away. And when he did, he asked to have the interview transcript read back to him. Raymond Doyle, 39 years old, born in Springfield, Illinois. Documents listed him as temporarily unemployed. Before that, 5 years as a mechanic with Amtrak's Mechanical Division, Chicago Service Center. Terminated 18 months earlier, voluntary resignation on record. On this exact route, on this exact model of Superliner car. Shaw read the transcript 3 times, then called the technical department. The onboard recorder had logged the emergency signal at 3:14:07. Emergency brake in Car 7 pulled. Signal transmitted to the locomotive control system. Received. Logged. The system should have triggered emergency braking within 4 to 6 seconds at most. The train did not stop. It kept moving for 12 minutes and 4 seconds until Engineer Pullman received the signal from the dispatcher, from the central hub through a secondary channel. 12 minutes. At 138 kilometers per hour, that's 27 kilometers of track. 27 kilometers, in which someone jumped from the moving train into the dark, hit the embankment, and walked away. This was either a technical malfunction or something else. Shaw submitted a formal request to the Amtrak Technical Operations Division. The response came 6 hours later. Senior engineer Thomas Briggs, 51 years old, master-level rolling stock diagnostic engineer, 28 years in the field. In 1998, he personally participated in the investigation of a derailment outside Decatur, Illinois, where brake system failure killed 3 people. Since then, he had known the Superliner series the way a doctor knows a long-term patient. He arrived on site the following morning. He requested access to the mechanical bay of Car 7, spent 2 hours and 40 minutes inside. When he emerged, he was holding one component: an emergency pressure relief valve, small, about the size of a fist, unremarkable to look at. Briggs set it on the table in front of Shaw and said one sentence: "It was manually disengaged, before the brake was pulled." Shaw asked what that meant. Briggs explained. On the Superliner series cars that had been in service on this route since 2009, there was a structural characteristic of the pneumatic brake system that only people who had worked directly with this equipment were aware of. If the valve was manually displaced to a specific position, not removed, not broken, specifically manually displaced by 3 millimeters in one motion, the system would register the emergency brake signal but would not relay the command to the locomotive's actuating mechanism. The train would continue moving. The signal in the onboard log would be there. The braking would not happen. This was not a documented vulnerability. It was something mechanics had known among themselves, unofficially, for years. Doyle had worked on this route for 5 years. Shaw asked Briggs to answer one question, a simple one. Could a person without hands-on experience with this class of car have located this valve by accident? Briggs thought for a second. "No," he said. "You have to know it's there. You have to remember it, for years." Shaw asked Briggs to estimate when the manipulation had occurred. Briggs said, based on the wear pattern on the valve's threaded fitting and the marks on the metal surface, the manipulation had been carried out no later than 2 hours before the emergency brake was pulled, most likely between 1 a.m. and 1:30 a.m., which meant roughly when all 3 in compartment 6 were already asleep. Doyle hadn't acted on impulse. He came to the car prepared. He disengaged the valve first, then went back to his compartment, lay down, waited, and only at 3:14, when everything was done, pulled the brake and jumped. 12 minutes. That was exactly how much time he needed. He had known this in advance. The forensic team worked in compartment 6 from sunrise, 7 hours. Detective Shaw was present for most of it. The knife was found under the lower bunk, wrapped in a plastic bag. A folding knife with a fixed blade, 7 inches in length. No prints on the handle. Either he'd worn gloves or wiped it down. On the blade, the blood of all 3. The lab would confirm this 3 days later. The sequence was established from the positions of the bodies and the angle of the wounds. First, Holt on the upper bunk. He never woke up. Second, Mercer, who, based on the position of his body, had managed to turn over. Third, Webb, the construction worker from Bloomington, the one who had been the first to stand up that night. Forensic specialist Dr. Patricia Ames, 37 years old, specializing in trace evidence and event sequence reconstruction, would later write in her report, no evidence of active resistance was identified in the compartment. Doyle acted quickly and methodically. The entire episode, by her estimate, took between 4 and 6 minutes. What struck me, she told Shaw, was that nothing had been knocked over. The thermos was exactly where it had been. The bag of food in its place. Holt's phone was right where he'd left it, as if Nothing had happened. That's the most disturbing part, I think. She paused, then said quietly, "I photographed the thermos last. I don't know why. I just couldn't leave." The search for Doyle began at 4:15 when it was established that his compartment 8 was empty. By then, more than an hour had passed since the jump. The approximate landing zone was calculated from the onboard recorder data. Mile marker 24 on the Springfield-Litchfield stretch, an embankment roughly 4 meters high. To the right, open fields. To the left, a tree line. The investigative team was on site at 5:40. It was getting light. Tracks on the embankment, not skid marks, not the signs of a fall. The footprints of someone who had jumped and walked away, straight toward the trees. The medical examiner who inspected the site noted, jumping from a train at even 50 or 60 miles per hour typically produces injuries incompatible with immediate movement. At 86, almost certainly. The tracks said otherwise. This meant one of two things. Either the train's speed at the moment of the jump had been considerably lower than logged, or Doyle had prepared for this jump not just theoretically. Shaw requested the speed data for the moment the emergency brake was activated. The onboard recorder showed, at 3:14:07, speed was 138 kilometers per hour. 30 seconds later, 112. After a minute, 94. The system had in fact initiated braking, with a delay through the emergency circuit. Briggs clarified, with the valve manually displaced, the system isn't completely disabled. It delays the response by approximately 30 to 40 seconds. Doyle knew this as well. The jump was calculated for the moment when speed had already begun to drop, but the train hadn't yet stopped. 3:14 plus 40 seconds. Speed, roughly 110 kilometers per hour. An embankment sloping toward the open field. A tree line 150 meters away. He had prepared for this jump, physically, it appears. In his apartment in Springfield, where the investigative team arrived 8 hours after the search began, they found on the balcony a gym mat and a climbing harness. The neighbor across the hall, Ruth Chandler, 62, retired, said, "He used to practice in the evenings, jumping. I figured, well, the man's keeping fit. Who could have known?" She didn't finish, looked away, then added quietly, "He used to take out my trash sometimes. I never asked. He'd just see it and do it." Doyle was arrested on the third day, not in Springfield, in Champaign. He had rented a room using a false ID, purchased, as investigators would later determine, 6 weeks before the trip. He moved around using public transit, commuter rail, buses, never once a taxi or a personal vehicle. He wasn't tracked down by cameras or by his phone. By a pharmacy. On the second day after the escape, he walked into a pharmacy on Neal Street in Champaign and bought bandages, pain medication, and a shoulder stabilizing brace. Pharmacist Amy Ross, 29 years old, remembered him. Not because he acted strangely, but because he paid slowly, using only one hand, and asked her to open the packaging right there at the register. When the alert came through to the local precinct, Ross called in herself. "He asked for a glass of water," she said afterward. "I poured it. He took the pill and said thank you. A perfectly ordinary man. Only, his eyes weren't looking at me. They were looking past me." Officers picked him up in that same room on the morning of the third day. He didn't resist. At the time of arrest, he had a broken collarbone and 3 broken ribs. Fresh fractures. He offered no explanation. The investigation reconstructed the timeline step by step. Store receipts, security camera footage from stations and shopping centers, cell tower records. He'd thrown away his phone on day 1, but before that, the SIM card had logged several locations. 3 months before the trip, Doyle begins studying the schedule of train 142. This followed from the browser history on his home computer. 8 weeks out, he acquires a false ID. This followed from a messaging thread found on an old phone. 6 weeks out, he begins practicing on his balcony, confirmed by neighbor Ruth Chandler. 4 weeks out, he inspects the brake compartment of a superliner car at one of the maintenance yards in Springfield. How he got onto the property, investigators would establish later. His expired Amtrak employee badge. Outdated, but security let him through. 2 weeks out, he purchases a folding knife at an outdoor sporting goods store on Veterans Parkway. Cash. 3 days out, he books a berth in compartment 8 of car 7, train 142. The departure date was not chosen at random. It was one of 2 dates that month when there were no scheduled track inspection windows on the Springfield to Litchfield stretch. He knew the inspection schedule. He had worked in this system for 5 years. Shaw did not identify the motive right away. The early theories, robbery, personal grudge, random victim, none of them fit. Neither Mercer, nor Holt, nor Webb had any connection to Doyle. No money was taken from the compartment. Phones were left untouched. Then the detective pulled the termination file. 18 months earlier, Doyle had been dismissed following an internal review. The reason? Violation of maintenance procedure protocol. Specifically, a discrepancy in documentation for a scheduled car inspection. In plain terms, he had signed off on a service check he hadn't performed. The review had been initiated by the shift supervisor, Gerald Mercer, Daniel Mercer's father, 60 years old. His birthday, a restaurant in St. Louis. Shaw closed the folder, then opened it again. Doyle hadn't boarded at random. He knew who Daniel Mercer was. He knew where he was going and why. He chose the adjacent compartment. He waited. The confrontation in the corridor wasn't chance. It was reconnaissance. A check of who was in the compartment and how they'd respond. Holt and Webb had ended up there by circumstance. Detective Shaw would later write in the case file, "Victims Holt, K.A., and Webb, M.T., were not the intended targets of the perpetrator. Their deaths resulted from the need to eliminate witnesses." One sentence in an official document. Behind it, 2 people who had simply bought tickets. The trial was held 11 months later. Doyle did not enter a guilty plea. Throughout the proceedings, he gave testimony in a flat, uninflected voice, as though discussing someone else's case. His attorney argued for an emotional breakdown, absence of premeditation, insufficiency of the evidentiary record. The prosecution presented 83 items of physical evidence. Among them, a printout of the browser history showing the dates on which train 142's schedule had been researched. The receipt from the sporting goods store on Veterans Parkway. Briggs's technical report on the valve. The climbing harness from the balcony of the Springfield apartment. Forensic experts had found on it traces of track ballast specifically characteristic of the Springfield-Litchfield stretch. This last item the court received in silence. The defense attorney had no response. Senior engineer Thomas Briggs testified as the technical expert. 3 hours. The court listened without interruption. He explained that the manipulation of the valve could not have been accidental, that a person without specialized knowledge of this class of car would have had no awareness of this point's existence, that the very fact of the valve's disengagement 2 hours before the emergency brake was pulled meant the actions had been planned in advance, in multiple stages, with a full technical understanding of the sequence. This was not an impulsive reaction, Briggs said in the courtroom. This was an engineering problem, which he solved. Doyle listened to this without changing his expression, then asked to be heard. The judge allowed it. He said one sentence, that Gerald Mercer had destroyed his life. He did not add anything else. Doyle received a life sentence. Gerald Mercer, 60 years old, shift supervisor. The man who 18 months earlier had signed the termination order learned of his son's death the morning after the events on the train. He received a call at 6:40. He drove to the morgue that same day. At the inquest, he gave testimony once. He spoke quietly, without pauses, without tears. At the end, the detective asked whether he had known that Doyle might have harbored a grievance after the termination. Gerald Mercer was silent for several seconds. "I was doing my job," he said. "He hadn't performed the inspection. I signed the violation report. That is my job." He did not add anything else. The embankment at mile marker 24 on the Springfield-Litchfield stretch looks the same now as it did that night. Dark tree line to the left, open fields to the right, 4 meters of drop, hard ballast below. The tracks on the ballast gone long ago. They were photographed and documented in the first hours. The images are in the case file. In one photograph you can see it clearly. The tracks run straight. No chaos, no stumbling. A person who landed and walked in a predetermined direction. He knew where to jump. He knew where to go. He knew how much time he had. Exactly 12 minutes. It was enough.